There's a kind of silence in the high mountains that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something holding its breath. I've spent enough years above the tree line to know the difference between quiet and waiting, between a valley that's simply empty and one that's been emptied. The difference is something you feel before you understand it, somewhere between your sternum and your spine, a low pressure like weather coming in off a ridge you can't yet see. Cody felt it first. He always did. My dog, part blue heeler, part something stubborn and ancient I've never been able to name, stopped on the trail at 11,000 feet and refused to move forward. Not the freeze of a dog that smelled a bear or a mountain lion. Not the alert posture of prey scent. Something quieter than that. He sat down in the middle of the trail, looked up at me with those pale, mismatched eyes and waited. I thought he was tired. I was wrong. What we found in that narrow cut of mountain, tucked against a granite outcrop like it had grown there over decades rather than been left. What was inside it, what it meant, and what it cost both of us to understand, is something I've been trying to write down for 3 years now. I'm not sure I have the words yet, but I'm going to try. My name is Harlan Briggs, and I keep a field log. Have since I was 19, when a forest ranger named Dottie Marsh handed me a green composition notebook and told me that the only way to survive a long season in the backcountry was to write down what you saw before your brain decided to rewrite it into something more comfortable. Memory is a liar, she said. Paper is honest. I've filled 41 of those notebooks over the years. I'm on my 42nd now, and there are pages in it I still can't read without sitting down first. This story starts in one of them. A September entry 3 years back, when the aspen had already gone gold along the lower slopes, and the upper country was stripped bare and magnificent and cold in that particular way it gets when summer has genuinely surrendered and isn't pretending anymore. I was 6 days into a 10-day solo circuit through a section of the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado that most people don't bother with. Not because it's inaccessible, though it is, but because it doesn't have a name anyone recognizes, doesn't show up in the glossy trail guides, doesn't photograph well. It's the kind of country that rewards people who aren't looking for a reward. Jagged country, honest country. The kind that makes you feel very precisely how small you are without being cruel about it. I was moving north along a drainage I'll call Escondido Creek, not its official name, just what I'd started calling it on account of how thoroughly it had managed to hide itself from every topographic map I owned. The trail, such as it was, had been a game trail once, maybe a prospector's route even earlier, and it wound through stands of Engelmann spruce that were old enough to have opinions. Cody moved 3 yards ahead of me the way he always did, ears rotating independently like small radar dishes, nose working the air in that constant, systematic way that always made me think of a librarian cataloging. He was 7 years old that September. Blue heeler on his mother's side, something else on his father's that I'd spent years trying to identify without success. He had one eye the color of ice over shallow water, one the color of a September sky, and a face that had learned, over our years together, to communicate disapproval with startling precision. We'd been partners for all 7 of those years. He'd never been a pet exactly, more of a colleague, one with considerably better instincts and considerably worse table manners. The morning had been straightforward, 5 miles of steady climbing, a short rest at a spring that was barely a seep by September, a lunch of jerky and hard cheese that Cody accepted his share of with the quiet dignity of someone who deserved better. The sky was the particular flat blue that comes before altitude weather, the kind that looks benign until you remember you're at nearly 12,000 feet, and weather up here doesn't knock before it arrives. I had my eye on a pass about 2 miles north. The plan was to cross it before early afternoon, drop into the next drainage, make camp in the trees before the temperature swung. A simple plan, the kind that holds until it doesn't. Cody stopped at the mouth of a narrow cut that angled off the main drainage to the east, a slot canyon of sorts, though that's a generous description for what was really just a deep crease in the mountain's flank, maybe 40 feet wide at the entrance, granite walls going up 60 or 70 feet on either side, the floor littered with the debris of 100 springs. Fractured stone, ancient deadfall, the bleached bones of something that had come in here to die a very long time ago. He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He sat down, looked back at me, and waited. "What?" I said. He looked at the canyon. "There's nothing in there." He looked back at me with that particular expression that meant he considered the gap between my perceptions and reality to be both significant and somewhat embarrassing. I had a schedule to keep, a pass to cross, and a camp to make before dark. I also had 41 years of field experience that had taught me, repeatedly and sometimes painfully, that when Cody sat down and waited, the correct response was to stop walking and pay attention. I stopped walking. I paid attention. The cut was maybe 100 yards deep from where I stood. The light got strange in there. The granite walls caught the morning sun and bounced it around in ways that were difficult to interpret, casting shadows where shadows shouldn't be and illuminating patches of wall in a pale gold that looked almost artificial. The floor was uneven, cut through with the remnants of snowmelt channels, and the deadfall was dense enough in places to require scrambling. I didn't see anything, but I heard it, or didn't hear it, in that particular way Dottie Marsh had tried to explain to me once. The absence of expected sound. The cut should have had wind moving through it. Should have had the small sounds of birds, of settling rock, of the ambient aliveness that mountain terrain carries even in its quietest moments. It was silent the way a room is silent when someone has just stopped speaking. "All right," I told Cody. He stood and walked into the cut without looking back to see if I was following. He knew I was. He always knew. The first 100 feet were rough going. Boulders the size of kitchen appliances, deadfall stacked chest-high in places, narrow channels where the spring runoff had carved grooves in the granite deep enough to snap an ankle if you weren't watching your feet. I was watching my feet. Cody picked his way through with the uncanny proprioception of a dog who has spent his whole life navigating terrain that was designed to inconvenience bipeds. The light shifted as we moved deeper. The granite walls narrowed, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a conversation narrows when something important is about to be said. The sky above us reduced to a stripe of flat blue maybe 20 feet wide. I smelled it before I saw it. Old wood, old metal. Something else underneath that I couldn't name, but that triggered a memory I couldn't locate. Something deep and pre-verbal, the kind of memory that lives in the body rather than the mind. Then the cut opened slightly, a natural widening maybe 60 feet across, and I saw the wagon. It was pushed hard against the eastern wall, or what remained of it had settled there over what I would later estimate, wrongly, to be decades. The wood was gray and checked, split along the grain in the way old timber splits, not broken but resolved, the way old things accept their condition. The wheels were iron-rimmed, the iron itself the color of dried blood, flaking in long curls that had fallen to the stone around the base like rust-colored leaves. What remained of the canvas cover had long since surrendered to weather and time. There were tatters of it still attached to the bows, stiff as dried skin, the color of old bone. It was a Studebaker wagon, or had been once. The body style was right for the 1880s. High-sided, built for mountain freight, the kind of wagon that moved supply lines through Colorado's mining country during the boom years, when men were pulling silver and gold out of every crack in these mountains, and spending it just as fast back in the valley towns. I stood at the entrance to that widening and looked at it for a long time. Cody had walked forward and was standing beside it, nose working the gap between the wagon's side boards and the canyon wall. Not alarmed, not excited, just reading something I didn't have the senses to perceive. "How old do you think?" I asked him. He didn't answer, which I considered unhelpful. I walked forward and put my hand on the side of the wagon. The wood was hard as stone, no give at all, no flex, just the pure dense weight of timber that had gone beyond decay into something approaching permanence. The iron wheel rim came up to my chest. The wagon was large, built for heavy loads, for mountain passes, for the kind of work that breaks lesser things. The tailgate was missing, or rather it was present but had fallen inward. I could see it lying flat inside the wagon bed, the wood bowed and split, a plank of it diagonal across the interior, canted at the angle of something that had given up its purpose but not yet disappeared. I looked inside. I need to stop here and say something about what I expected to find, because what I found wasn't it. In 41 years of backcountry travel, I had found abandoned things before: a rotted sheepherder's wagon in the Sangers, a collapsed prospector's camp in the Elks, a rusted ore bucket hanging in a shaft mouth on a peak above Silverton. Found things, logged them, moved on. The mountains are a repository of abandoned ambitions. There's nothing mystical about it. People came into the high country with intentions and left without them, and the things they left behind are simply evidence, artifacts of effort, not monuments to failure. I expected to find rotted gear, maybe the remnants of mining equipment, possibly a crate or two, likely nothing intact. I found a blanket. Folded. It was Navajo work. I recognized the pattern immediately, the geometric interlocking of red and black on a cream ground that had once been white. It was folded with a precision that seemed impossible given the chaos of everything else in and around the wagon. 4 neat folds, the blanket placed on top of a wooden box that was itself sitting atop the remains of what appeared to be a canvas-wrapped bundle, and the whole arrangement set against the front board of the wagon with the kind of deliberate care that implied intention. That implied someone had placed these things here meaning to come back for them. Or meaning to leave them. Cody put his front paws on the wagon's side and looked in. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the blanket. I couldn't read his expression beyond the fact that it was not. Whatever he'd been expecting was apparently not this either. I didn't touch anything yet. That's a rule I've kept since Dottie first taught it to me. See before you touch, think before you move, write before you interpret. So I stood there with my hands at my sides, and I looked and I tried to understand what I was seeing before I decided what it meant. The blanket was old, not 1880s old, or not necessarily. Navajo weaving traditions persisted, and a mid-20th century blanket could look similar to an earlier one to an untrained eye. But the colors, the quality of the wool, the weight and density of the weave, these felt older than me, considerably. The wooden box beneath it was maybe 18 inches long, 12 wide, 8 deep. Plain pine hand-joined, no hardware except a simple wooden clasp on the front. The box was dark with age but intact, no major splitting, no collapse. The canvas bundle beneath the box was largely deteriorated. I could see the outline of something underneath the remaining canvas, an elongated shape, maybe 4 feet long, wrapped and tied. The ties themselves were rawhide, dried to a consistency somewhere between wood and leather, still holding. Someone had arranged these things carefully. Someone had wanted them to stay. I pulled out my field log and started writing. The writing took 20 minutes. I noted the dimensions of the wagon, the approximate state of deterioration, the contents as I could observe them without disturbing anything, the precise location. I shot a GPS point, marked the canyon entrance, described the terrain features I'd use to navigate back. I sketched the interior arrangement, the placement of the blanket, the box, the bundle, the fallen tailgate. My handwriting is poor under the best of circumstances and gets worse when my hands are cold, which they were. The field log from that day is partly illegible, and there are places where what I wrote doesn't match what I remember seeing, which is either evidence of Dottie's point about memory being a liar or evidence that I was more shaken than I understood at the time. While I wrote, Cody sat beside the wagon and kept watch. That's not anthropomorphizing, it's observation. He was facing outward, toward the entrance of the cut, his body still but his attention complete, the posture of an animal that has decided this place requires guarding. I finished writing and looked at him. "I'm going to open the box," I told him. He didn't move. The wooden clasp was stuck, not locked, just frozen with age and moisture and time. I pressed it gently, then less gently, then with the careful, steady pressure of someone who is trying not to break something irreplaceable. It gave with a sound that was less a crack than an exhalation, the sound of something held closed for a very long time, releasing its grip. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth and was now a blackened, stiff material that crumbled at the edges when I touched it, documents. Paper, ink, writing. I sat down on the canyon floor. Cody came and sat beside me, his flank against my leg, warm and solid, and I understood, as I would understand more fully over the following days and weeks and years, that we had found something I wasn't equipped to understand in the time I had before the weather turned, and the light failed, and the mountain reminded me that it didn't care about my discoveries. I read the first page. Then I read it again. Then I sat with my dog in a granite cut at 11,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains, and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite grief, but was threaded through with all three. What I held in my hands was a letter. Addressed, though I didn't understand to whom, not yet, to the one who finds this after we are gone. I closed the box. I put my hand on Cody's head. He leaned into me. "Okay," I said, to him, to the canyon, to the mountain, to whatever had drawn us into this cut instead of continuing north. "Okay." The sky above us had gone the flat white of incoming weather. I had a decision to make. The decision wasn't whether to take the documents. I knew even then that removing artifacts from the backcountry without reporting them and coordinating with the appropriate authorities was both illegal and wrong. I'd spent my career working adjacent to that world. I'm a retired range conservationist, federal land management, 30 years of it, which means I have strong opinions about proper handling of cultural resources. The decision was, do I make camp here in this cut with this wagon and wait out whatever weather was coming? Or do I document what I could, leave everything in place, and get over the pass before conditions closed in? I looked at the sky. I looked at the wagon. I looked at Cody. He was looking at the canvas bundle, the elongated one wrapped in deteriorated canvas tied with rawhide, the one I hadn't touched. "What's in there?" I asked him. He looked at me. He didn't know either, or if he did, he wasn't saying. I checked my map. The pass was still 2 miles north. If the weather came in hard, and the sky was suggesting it intended to, the pass could be impassable by late afternoon and might stay that way for 12 to 24 hours. Making camp in the cut meant shelter, but it meant camping next to something I hadn't processed, hadn't understood, hadn't yet properly situated in any context I could hold. I took photographs, dozens of them. Every angle, every detail, close-ups of the blanket's weave, the box's construction, the contents without removing them, the canvas bundle, the wagon's ironwork, the layout of the canyon, the position of the wagon against the wall. Then I closed the oilcloth over the documents as carefully as I could manage, replaced the box lid, smoothed the Navajo blanket back over the top. I was going to make camp. Not in the cut. The cut was wrong for it. Too enclosed, bad drainage, no way to read the weather. But nearby. I'd find a site in the trees below the entrance, close enough to return in the morning, close enough to feel connected to whatever this was without making the error of spending a night inside something I didn't understand. As I moved toward the cut's entrance, Cody paused beside the canvas bundle one more time. He put his nose against it, a long, deliberate sniff, the kind that catalogs rather than reacts. His tail moved once, a slow half-wag, the gesture of a dog who has confirmed something he suspected. Then he turned and followed me out. I wrote 3 more pages in my field log that night, by headlamp, sitting in my tent while rain turned to sleet and the mountain expressed its seasonal opinions. I wrote everything I'd seen. I wrote what I'd felt. I wrote my questions in a column on the right side of the page because Dottie had taught me to separate observation from interpretation, and I was trying. The questions column was longer than the observations column. The longest question was the last one. Who were they, and what happened to them after they left this here? I didn't sleep well. Cody slept across my feet and didn't seem troubled by any of it, which I found both comforting and faintly envious. In the morning, I would go back. In the morning, I would open the canvas bundle. But that night in the rain and the cold, what I kept returning to, what I couldn't put down the way I'd put down the box and the blanket, was that phrase from the letter. The one who finds this after we are gone. Not if someone finds this. Not to whoever this may concern. After we are gone. They had known. They had known they were leaving, and they had known they were not coming back, and they had left these things, these carefully arranged, deliberately preserved, oilcloth-wrapped things, for someone who wouldn't exist for years or decades or a century. They had trusted the mountain to hold what they left. They had trusted time to deliver it. I lay there in the dark listening to the sleet on my tent fly, and I thought about that kind of faith. The faith of people who arrange things carefully and then walk away. Cody shifted in his sleep, his legs moving through some dream terrain, some scent trail his waking nose couldn't follow. A small sound escaped him, not a whimper, not a bark, just a soft exhalation with a tone in it. I put my hand on his side and felt him breathe. Outside, the mountain was loud with weather. Inside, I was very quiet. The sleet stopped somewhere around 3 in the morning. I know this because I was awake for it, not the stopping exactly, but the change in sound. Sleet-on-tent fabric has a particular urgency, a millions of small accusations quality, and when it softened to rain and then to nothing, the silence was different from the silence before the storm. Cleaned out somehow. The mountain had said what it needed to say, and was now listening. I got up at first light, which at that elevation and that latitude in mid-September arrives with no sentimentality whatsoever. Gray, then less gray, then a cold pale gold along the eastern ridgeline that passed for dawn. I boiled water for coffee on my small stove, fed Cody his kibble plus a strip of jerky as an apology for the rough night, and sat outside my tent in my down jacket, watching the upper slopes emerge from the cloud. The pass above me was draped in new snow, not much 2 or 3 inches above 12,000 feet, but enough to confirm that yesterday's decision had been the right one. I'd have been caught on the face in that mess, and while it wouldn't have killed me, it would have made for a very unpleasant afternoon. I drank my coffee and wrote in my field log. The writing that morning was different from the frantic, questioning writing of the night before. Slower, more deliberate. I made a list of what I knew with certainty, the facts, stripped of interpretation, and then I made a separate list of what I intended to do about it. The second list had 2 items: return to the wagon and examine the canvas bundle, and contact the State Historic Preservation Office when I got back to Cell Range. Cody finished his breakfast and sat beside me, his mismatched eyes moving steadily along the tree line in his habitual morning security sweep. He was not a dog who trusted mornings uncritically. "Ready?" I asked. He stood. We walked back to the cut. The canyon looked different in morning light, less atmospheric, more geological. The granite walls showed their texture clearly in the flat post-storm light, every crack and ledge and lichen patch rendered in sharp detail. The debris on the floor glittered where the rain had washed the dust off. The wagon sat where we'd left it, which felt like an observation worth noting. I'd been half expecting it to be gone. I've spent enough time in the backcountry to stop fully trusting my own perceptions at altitude and in emotional states, and last night I'd been in both conditions simultaneously. But the wagon was there, solid and gray and massive, the rust on the wheel rims dried darker by the rain, the tattered canvas cover stiff and motionless in the still post-storm air. Cody went to it without hesitation, put his paws on the side, checked the interior with a methodical sniff, then looked at me with an expression that communicated approximately, same as we left it. I came to the wagon and looked at the canvas bundle again. In daylight it was clearly very old. The canvas itself was a type I associated with late 19th century goods, a heavyweight cotton duck of a kind that hadn't been manufactured in the last 100 years. The rawhide ties were intact. 2 of them, each knotted with a simple but firm knot that had tightened as it dried until it was essentially a different material from the rawhide it had started as. I had a knife. I also had the strong sense that cutting those ties would be wrong, not legally wrong, not procedurally wrong, just wrong in some way I couldn't fully articulate. These ties had been tied by someone's hands. Someone who had handled this bundle, placed it here, arranged things around it with intention. Cutting them felt like interrupting. I worked at the knots instead. It took 15 minutes. My fingers aren't nimble even under good conditions, and the knots had fused over time in ways that required patience and a degree of faith that there was something worth uncovering underneath. Cody sat beside me the whole time. He didn't fidget. He has more patience than I do. The second knot released. I unrolled the canvas. Inside, a rifle. Winchester Model 1873, lever action, chambered in .4440. I recognized it immediately, not just the model but the particular wear pattern, the specific quality of the patina on the receiver, the way the stock had been wrapped at the grip with a strip of leather that had dried and darkened and contracted over time to become part of the wood itself. This wasn't a display piece. This was a working rifle, carried and used, its surfaces marked by years of handling, the stock worn smooth where hands had gripped it, the barrel showing the particular finish of a weapon that had been cleaned and oiled methodically and regularly. There was also, wrapped separately in a cloth that had mostly disintegrated, a leather pouch. The pouch contained cartridges, 34 of them, each one still in its original brass case, intact, the bullet tips uncorroded in the dry mountain air, and beneath the cartridges, wrapped in a smaller piece of that same deteriorated cloth, a photograph. A tintype specifically. approximately 3 by 4 inches. Two figures, a man and a woman, standing in front of something I couldn't immediately identify, a structure, perhaps, or a wall. The man was in his 30s or 40s, lean and straight, wearing working clothes that placed him in the latter half of the 19th century. Canvas pants, braces, a collarless shirt, a hat he was holding in his hands at waist level in the formal pose that the long exposure times of early photography demanded. His face was angular, the expression the not-quite-smiling expression that all tintypes carry. The photograph didn't capture a moment so much as a sustained effort at stillness. The woman beside him was Apache. I knew this not from any single feature, but from the combination of details. The clothing, the style of her hair, the particular quality of jewelry visible at her wrist in the photograph's modest detail. She was tall, nearly the man's height, and she was not holding herself in the formal stillness the photograph required. She was leaning slightly toward him, a posture that was either defiance of the camera's demands or such complete unself-consciousness that formality hadn't occurred to her. She was looking directly into the lens. He was looking at her. I sat down on the canyon floor with the tintype in my hands, and I looked at this for a long time. Cody came and put his chin on my knee. I looked at the photograph, and I looked at the letter I'd already partially read, and I began to understand. Imperfectly, partially, with all the limitations of a man who is a stranger to this history, what I was looking at. I went back to the box and removed the documents more carefully this time. Laid them on the blanket, which I'd spread across the wagon's side to give me a clean surface. The oilcloth wrapping had protected them extraordinarily well. The paper was brittle at the edges but largely intact, the ink faded but legible, the handwriting clear and consistent. There were 12 pages. The letter was in English, written in two different hands that I could identify clearly, one large and somewhat irregular, as if written by someone who had learned English as a second or third language, or who had learned it late, or who was not accustomed to writing at length. The second hand was smaller, more practiced, a hand that had been shaped by some education, though not a formal one. The letters were correct, but the spacing was irregular, the pressure uneven, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who writes when they need to rather than as a habit. The letter was dated September 1891. I did the math involuntarily. 135 years, give or take, from then to the morning I was sitting in this canyon with my dog and this photograph and these pages. The letter began, and I am going to reproduce it here as faithfully as my field log allowed, which is to say imperfectly, because my transcription was hurried and the handwriting was faded, and I was not in a composed state. With this. We are writing this together, Cena and I, though I am writing it because she says my handwriting is cleaner, which is not true but which I accept because she is right about most things and I have learned not to argue the small ones. We are leaving this in the wagon because we cannot take it where we are going. The rifle was her father's. The blanket was her mother's. If you are reading this, then we are either very far away or we are dead, and either way we are beyond worrying about these things. We want you to know how they came to be here. I stopped there. I read that paragraph 4 times. I was aware of several things simultaneously. The cold of the canyon floor under me, the particular stillness of the post-storm air, Cody's weight against my leg, the sound of water moving somewhere farther into the cut, a small drainage running, fed by yesterday's rain. I was aware of the photograph still in my hand, the man looking at the woman looking at the camera. Cena. I turned the tintype over. On the back, in ink that was faded nearly to invisibility but still readable in the flat morning light, Cena running waiter and Thomas Briggs, Durango, Colorado, August 1888. The air went very still. I looked at the name on the back of the photograph. I looked at my own hand holding it. Thomas Briggs. My name is Harlan Briggs. I'm not a man who believes in coincidence in any cosmic or mystical sense. I'm a federal land manager. I believe in documentation and evidence and the prosaic explanations that usually turn out to be correct. But I sat in that canyon with my dog, and I held that photograph, and I felt something move through me that wasn't fear and wasn't recognition, and wasn't quite either of those, but was something that had qualities of both. Briggs is not an uncommon name. The American West is full of Briggses and Johnsons and Clarks, the descendants of settlers who came from the same eastern states with the same surnames, and spread out across the landscape, and diversified into separate family lines that share a name and nothing else. Probably nothing. I kept reading. The letter, taken in its full 12 pages, was the story of two people. Thomas Briggs, a freight hauler it appeared, who worked the mountain routes supplying mining camps in the San Juans during the boom years of the 1880s, and Cena Runningwaiter, whose Apache family had lived in and moved through this high country for generations before the mining boom arrived with its roads, and its noise, and its systematic disruption of everything that had been in place before. They had met. The letter described this in a way that was both factual and touched with a quality I can only call shy, as if the telling of it was still somewhat embarrassing or surprising to both of them. In the fall of 1887, near a spring that was probably the same one I'd passed the morning before. Thomas's lead mule had broken down, and he was stranded with a wagon full of goods and no way to move it. And Cena, traveling alone through country she'd known since childhood, had stopped because stopping to help was not a decision she'd made, but simply something she'd done before she'd thought about whether to do it. The letter described what followed over the next 3 years in a way that was not romantic in the literary sense. There were no declarations, no scenes of passion, but was romantic in the true sense, which is to say it documented two people building a life in the only space available to them, which was limited and contested and frequently hostile, and which they occupied anyway with something that looked, from the distance of 135 years, a great deal like commitment. They had faced, the letter made clear, a significant and specific problem. The year was 1890. The world in which they existed did not easily accommodate what they were, a white freight hauler and an Apache woman together in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, in a period when the policies of the United States government toward Apache people were violent and ongoing and systematic. There were places they could not go. There were things they could not openly be. There were people on both sides of the line that existed between them who had their own opinions about the arrangement, and were prepared to express those opinions in ways that ranged from social pressure to active danger. Thomas had wanted to go north, Montana perhaps, or further, start over somewhere the names were different. Cena had refused. This was the emotionally heavy center of the letter, and it was written, this section, in the second handwriting, the one I'd identified as hers. Smaller, more careful, and in places the pressure of the pen had increased to the point where the words were nearly gouged into the paper, the ink pooled in the hollows. She had written, I will not leave these mountains. My people have been leaving for 20 years. We have left enough. I understand what Thomas wants, and I understand why he wants it, and I am not saying he is wrong. But I am saying that I cannot. This is the land my mother taught me. These are the springs my father used. I know where the medicine plants grow above this creek, and I know which pass takes the fewest steps in deep snow, and I know this country the way I know my own hands. If I go north, I become a woman with no country, and I have seen what happens to people with no country, and I will not choose that for myself. I stopped reading when I got to the end of that section. I looked up at the walls of the cut, at the strip of sky, now bright and clear after the storm, at the aspen growing impossibly in a crack in the granite 30 feet up, its leaves gone gold, trembling in a wind I couldn't feel from the floor. Cody was watching me. She stayed, I told him. He already seemed to know. The rest of the letter was more compressed, 12 pages for 3 years of life, which is a ratio that tells you something about what had to be left out. They had found a way to continue. Thomas had modified his routes, his schedule, his arrangements in ways that gave them more time in the high country and less time in the valley towns where everything was more complicated. Cena had continued her own patterns, adapted around the increasing pressure on her people, kept her connections to the few family members who remained in the region. They had built, the letter said, a small cabin near a spring above the Escondido drainage, which meant, by my rough calculation, that they had built it within 2 miles of where I was sitting. And then 1891, the letter's date year. And something had changed. The last 2 pages were written in both hands, Thomas's larger hand in the main body, Cena's smaller hand in the margins. An interleaving, a conversation preserved in ink. Thomas had written about a decision. He didn't explain it fully. He wrote as if the person reading already knew the situation, or as if the explanation had become too large to fit in the remaining pages. What was clear was that they were leaving, not going north, not running. going somewhere specific, somewhere that was Cena's choice, and that Thomas had agreed to because he had understood, finally, that some decisions belong to the person with the deeper stake. In the margin beside this passage, in Cena's hand, he is a slow learner, but he learns. In Thomas's hand, responding in the margin to her margin note, she has always been patient with slow learners. In her hand, responding to that, not always. I read this exchange 3 times. It is the clearest window into who they were together, the quickness of it, the humor inside the weight of what they were doing. They were writing this in a canyon, probably the very canyon I was sitting in, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry, writing a letter to no one in particular, to whoever the mountain chose to send. And they were arguing in the margins, lightly, the way people argue who trust each other completely. The last lines of the letter were Thomas's. We leave the rifle because it cannot go where we are going. We leave the blanket because it belongs to a place, not a person, and the place is here. We leave this letter because someone should know we were here, that we tried, that we found something worth trying for. The mountains keep their own records. We hope they keep this one. Cena had written nothing after that. In the margin beside those last lines, she had drawn something instead of writing. A small symbol, possibly an Apache clan or family marking, possibly something personal, possibly something I had no context to read correctly. I photographed it. I sat with the 12 pages on the blanket that had been her mother's, and the rifle that had been her father's, and the photograph of the 2 of them, and I sat with all of it for a long time. Cody had moved to lie across my feet at some point while I was reading. I hadn't noticed until now the weight of him suddenly present. Outside the canyon, a hawk, red-tailed by the sound, gave its long, descending cry from somewhere above the rimrock. Okay, I said again, for what felt like the 3rd time in 2 days, okay to what I couldn't precisely have said. I replaced everything in the order I'd found it, the rifle in its canvas, the photograph in its cloth, the box's contents wrapped in their oilcloth, the box beneath the blanket folded in 4. I took one more photograph of the whole arrangement. Then I got out my field log and wrote for a very long time in very bad handwriting, the words crowding the margins of the pages, the questions column full and the observations column fuller. Somewhere in all of that writing, I noted the name on the tintype again. Thomas Briggs. I wrote probably nothing. And then 2 lines below that, because I've always been more honest in my field logs than I am in conversation, or something I'm not ready to think about yet. I'm writing this final section 2 years and 11 months after the morning in that canyon. I say that because the nature of what I'm about to tell you is different from what I've told you so far. Parts 1 and 2 are narration, events as they occurred, written from memory and field log, reconstructed as faithfully as I can manage, which is to say imperfectly. This part is something else. It's what happened afterward, which is a story that doesn't have clean edges and doesn't resolve the way stories are supposed to, and contains information that I'm still processing in ways I'm not sure I'll finish before I run out of time. Start with the practical. I filed a report with the Colorado State Historic Preservation Office within a week of returning from that trip. I submitted my photographs, my field log transcription, my GPS coordinates, my description of the wagon and its contents. The person who received the report was a cultural resource specialist named Annalise Morrow, who had been with SHPO for 20 years and who, when I sent her the photographs, called me back within 4 hours and said, in a voice carefully calibrated to professional neutrality that nonetheless contained a thread of something else. Mr. Briggs, where exactly did you say this was? I told her. She said she'd need to assemble a team. The team went in the following June. Myself, Morrow, a physical anthropologist named Dr. Yazzie from Fort Lewis College, 2 SHPO staff members, and a consultant from the Southern Ute Indian Tribes Cultural Resource Program, whose name I was asked not to include in anything public. It took us 2 days to reach the site from the trailhead, moving carefully with documentation equipment, and with the constraint that everything had to be handled according to federal cultural resource law, which meant slow and careful and thoroughly documented. The canyon was unchanged. This surprised me more than it should have. 9 months in the San Juan Mountains is nothing, geologically, and the granite and the iron and the dense old wood of the wagon were all materials built for the long game. But I'd had dreams about returning and finding it altered or absent, and the intact reality of it, the wagon against the wall, the blanket visible through the opening where the tailgate had fallen, hit me with a physical sensation I wasn't prepared for. Cody recognized it. He went directly to the wagon without hesitation, put his paws on the side, looked in, looked at me. Same as we left it. Dr. Yazzie spent 3 days with the contents. The rifle dated to the correct period. The cartridges were consistent with late 19th century manufacture. The tintype was analyzed and placed with reasonable confidence in the late 1880s. The blanket, this was the finding that required Yazzie to sit down and take a moment before he continued describing it, was older than the other contents. Significantly older. Its weave construction and the chemical composition of its dyes placed it at a minimum in the 1840s, possibly earlier. It had been made, repaired, and maintained across what appeared to be multiple decades. It was not a piece of the 1880s. It was a piece of a longer story, carried into the 1880s by someone who had kept it for a long time. Cena's mother's blanket. Possibly her grandmother's. The canvas bundle, the rawhide ties, the oilcloth protection of the documents. All of this pointed to a person with knowledge of how to preserve materials in high-altitude conditions. Morrow said this to me on the second day, quietly, in a way that wasn't quite a professional observation. Whoever packed this understood the environment. They knew how long they were leaving it. I asked her, how long do she think they intended for it to be there? She looked at me. I don't think they thought in terms of how long. I think they thought in terms of until found. And they built for until found to mean whatever it needed to mean. The documents, once conserved by a specialist Morrow brought in from Denver, yielded more than I'd been able to read in the canyon. My transcription had been imperfect. Hurried handwriting, cold fingers, emotional distortion. The full conserved text added 3 passages I'd missed or misread. One of them was a list. 7 names written in Cena's hand in the margin of the 9th page. No context, no explanation. Just 7 names in Apache and in English, each followed by a single word or phrase that might have been a relationship designation, a place name, or something else entirely. The specialist wasn't sure, and the Southern Ute consultant said she'd need more time with it, which she took. The names were family. That much became clear. The phrase beside each name, the word I couldn't immediately read and the consultant was cautious about, referred to direction. Not compass direction, something more conceptual. The consultant, when she finally shared her interpretation, chose her words carefully. She was naming where each person had gone, not geographically. She was noting their condition. Gone, not gone, gone ahead, waiting, searching. 5 of the 7 had a status that translated to one of the forms of gone. 2 did not. Cena, as of September 1891, was still here. And the second name without a gone marker, a name I won't reproduce here out of respect, was someone the consultant identified with appropriate caution as Cena's sister. They had each other. I wrote that in my field log that evening at the camp we'd made below the cut. Just those 3 words, they had each other. Cody slept against my leg, while the wind came down off the newly frozen upper slopes and moved through the aspens in long, gold-stripping gusts. Now I need to tell you about Thomas Briggs. I'd written probably nothing, and something I'm not ready to think about yet, and I'd meant both of those things. And for the first year after the discovery, I maintained them with something that felt like discipline but was probably more like avoidance. My name is common enough. The connection was not evidence. The connection was a feeling, and feelings are not evidence. And I spent 30 years in federal land management learning to separate those 2 things because the work required it. But I have a sister. Her name is Patricia, and she's 8 years older than me, and she's spent most of her adult life doing the one thing in our family that no one else has bothered to do. She's been tracing our genealogy. I had never been particularly interested. After September 2023, I became interested. Patricia is good at this. She has the patience for archives and the stubbornness for dead ends, and the flexibility for the discovery that the thing you thought you were looking for is not what you were looking for at all. She'd been working on our paternal line for years, going back through Harlan Briggs Sr., through a grandfather named Robert, through a great-grandfather she'd lost somewhere in the confusion of a family that had moved frequently and not always under the same recorded name. I called her in November 2023, 2 months after I got back from the canyon. I told her what I'd found. I told her the name on the tintype. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been trying to find a Thomas for 3 years." It took Patricia 4 more months to confirm it. The records were fragmentary, as they always are for this period, for people who lived in the margins of official documentation. But she found a Thomas Briggs in freight company records from Durango, Colorado, operating in the late 1880s. She found a property record in his name from 1888 that described a small cabin and associated improvements in a location in the San Juan Mountains. The description wasn't precise enough to triangulate against my GPS point, but the drainage name in the record was a variant of the name I'd been using, Escondido. She found in a church record from a small community near Farmington, New Mexico, dated 1893, the birth of a child. Father listed as Thomas Briggs, mother listed as Cena. No surname for the mother. The child, a son, was named Robert. "Robert Briggs," Patricia said very quietly. "That's our great-grandfather's name." I'm going to stop here and say something clearly. We have not proven this. We have suggestive evidence, circumstantial connections, a chain of names that could be coincidence at every link. The historical record for this period, for people like Thomas and Cena, is fragmentary by design. They were people who existed in spaces the official record didn't fully acknowledge, and the official record's gaps are not accidental. Patricia is still working on it. Morrow connected us with a genealogical DNA service that specializes in historical family research, and we've submitted for testing, and the results will tell us something but probably not everything, because the results never tell you everything. But I want to tell you what I believe, independent of what I can prove. I believe Thomas Briggs of the San Juan Mountains, freight hauler, slow learner, man who eventually understood that some decisions belong to the person with the deeper stake. I believe he was my great-great-grandfather. I believe Cena Running Waiter was my great-great-grandmother. I believe that the son born near Farmington in 1893 became Robert Briggs, who became part of a family that moved and changed and spread, and eventually produced a boy named Harlan who grew up to spend 30 years as a range conservationist in the backcountry of the American West, and who kept field logs because a woman named Dottie Marsh told him that paper was honest. I believe that Cena chose to stay in the mountains and that Thomas chose to stay with her, and that the thing they built together was small and impermanent in the way of all human things, and permanent in the way of all things that matter. I believe she wrapped her mother's blanket around her father's rifle and placed them in a wagon in a granite cut and knew, with the knowledge of someone who understood the mountains, that the cut would hold what she left there, that the dry, cold air above 10,000 feet is the best preservation environment in the natural world, that the granite walls would shelter it from weather, that someone eventually would be drawn into the cut by something they couldn't explain. I believe she trusted the mountain, and I believe the mountain, in its slow and patient way, delivered. Cody turned 10 last spring. The blue heeler part of him is showing its age in his muzzle, more gray now than the blue-black of his younger years. The other part, the unnamed part, whatever stubbornness and endurance his father contributed to his constitution, that hasn't changed. He moves slower on steep terrain. He still stops when he needs to stop. He still has better instincts than I do. We went back to the canyon in July of this year. Just the two of us, no team, no documentation equipment. I'm not sure I could articulate exactly why Morrow and Dr. Yazzie had done their work. The report had been filed, the artifacts had been properly handled, and are now in the care of the appropriate institutions. There was no professional reason to go back. I went back because I needed to. The wagon is still there. It will be there for some time. The SHPO determination was that it should remain in situ, stabilized but not moved, documented but not extracted. The mountain is its best context and its best preservation environment, and moving it would diminish both. This seems right to me. The blanket and the rifle are with the Southern Ute Cultural Resource Department now. The documents are in conservation. The photograph, the tintype of Thomas and Cena, him looking at her looking at the camera, is in a collection where it will be properly maintained. I have a copy. It sits on the shelf above my desk, leaning against a row of green composition notebooks. I stood in the canyon in July, and I looked at the wagon without the blanket and without the box and without the canvas bundle, and it looked, not diminished exactly, but quieter, like something that had said what it needed to say. Cody put his paws on the side and looked in. I stood beside him and looked with him. The wagon bed was empty now, just the old wood and the fallen tailgate and the dust that had accumulated through the winter. The place where the box had sat was marked by a faint rectangle of slightly lighter wood, protected from decades of atmospheric deposition by the box's presence. A ghost of a box. I thought about Cena arranging these things, the care she'd taken, the understanding she'd had of time, not as something that passes, but as something that accumulates, that carries. I thought about Thomas writing, "The mountains keep their own records." I thought about my great-great-grandfather, slow learner who learned. I thought about a boy named Robert, born in 1893 near Farmington, who grew up to be someone's father, who grew up to be part of a chain of people none of whom, until now, knew where they'd come from in quite this way. I thought about Patricia, still in archives somewhere, still pulling at threads. I thought about Dottie Marsh handing me my first composition notebook and saying, "Paper is honest. Here is what I know, finally, after 3 years. The mountains do keep their own records, not metaphorically, literally. In the dry cold above 10,000 feet, in granite cuts that shelter what's left in them from weather and time, in oilcloth wrappings and rawhide ties, and the dense old wood of a Studebaker wagon that was already ancient when it was pushed against that wall in September of 1891. The mountains keep records the way they keep snowpack and mineral deposits and the fossil record of ancient seas. Patiently, without agenda, available to whoever comes looking with the right attention. Cena understood this. She'd grown up in these mountains. She'd learned them the way she said, the springs, the passes, the medicine plants, the places where the snow deepens and the places where it doesn't. She knew that the cut would hold what she left in it. She knew that someone would come eventually. She trusted the mountain to do what mountains do. And she trusted, here's the thing that I keep returning to, the thing I can't quite put down, she trusted that the finding would matter. Not to her, not to Thomas. They were going somewhere they couldn't take these things, and whether they made it or didn't, the artifacts would outlast them and the finding would happen without them. She trusted that it would matter to whoever found it. I'd like to think she'd be satisfied with how it turned out. I'd like to think she'd find something appropriate in the fact that the person who came down that trail with a dog with mismatched eyes happened to carry the name of the slow learner she'd loved. Cody and I sat in the canyon for an hour that July morning, not doing anything in particular. Eating our respective lunches, jerky and hard cheese for me, kibble and a strip of jerky for him, our standard arrangement, unchanged in a decade of these trips. The hawks were working the thermals above the rimrock, 2 of them, circling in long, patient loops. The aspens in the crack of the granite had survived another winter and were going strong, a cluster of them now where there'd been one before, the root system apparently finding whatever it needed in the rock. Before we left, I took out my field log, the 42nd one, the one that started with that September entry, and I wrote a short entry. I wrote the date, I wrote our location, I wrote everything as left. Then, below that, because I've always been more honest in my field logs than in conversation. I don't know what she'd make of me. I think she'd have something to say about the field log habit, a small criticism, affectionately delivered. She seemed like someone who had opinions about record-keeping. She seemed like someone who had opinions about most things and was right about most of them. Thomas was right about one thing, at least. The mountain kept the record. The rest of us are still working out what it means. I closed the notebook. Cody had already gotten up and was heading toward the canyon entrance, ready, as he always is, to move before I am. His tail, that slow half-wag he reserves for moments of private satisfaction. I followed him out into the light.